There is an image, cast in bronze and carved in stone, that stands at the very dawn of Roman history. It is an image of profound and savage strangeness, a vision that is both a symbol of salvation and a testament to a brutal beginning. Picture it, a gaunt she-wolf, her head turned in a tense feral snarl, her body coiled with wild energy. And beneath her, nestled against her belly, are not cubs, but two human infants, their mouths open and eager at the unlikely cradle of her teats. This is the Lupa Capitolina, the Capitoline wolf, and the children are the legendary founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. It is a symbol that has echoed through millennia, the emblem of a people who chose to trace their origins not to a peaceful garden or a divine covenant, but to the den of a predator in the wilderness. From this feral seed, this moment of mythic abandonment and animalistic mercy, grew the most powerful and enduring empire the Western world has ever known. An empire of unparalleled order, of stone-faced legions marching on perfectly engineered roads, of aqueducts that carried life across mountains, and of a legal code that would shape the destiny of nations yet unborn. An empire that would give us the stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, the poetry of Virgil, and the monumental, blood-soaked spectacle of the Colosseum. How can we reconcile these two images? How does the story of two outcast infants, suckled by a wolf, become the foundational myth for a civilization defined by its obsession with law, discipline, and absolute authority? This profound paradox is the key to understanding the Roman soul. To begin our exploration into the heart of Roman identity, we must ask the fundamental question: did any of it truly happen? Was there a real Romulus who murdered his brother to found a city? Or is this epic, which stands as the bedrock of Roman civilization, nothing more than a foundational myth, a brilliant fiction designed to explain, and perhaps to justify, the ruthless character of an empire? Welcome to Ancient History Concepts. In our deep dive today, our purpose is not simply to retell this famous story, but to dissect it. We will treat the legend of Romulus and Remus as a psychological blueprint, a document that reveals what the Romans believed about themselves, their destiny, and their gods. We will ask what it means for a civilization to build its identity upon a narrative of divine violence, fratricide, and the absolute conviction that the security of their walls was a cause for which even a brother's blood was an acceptable price. We are about to explore a world where destiny is inescapable, where violence is a creative force, and where the greatest city in history was founded upon the murder of a brother. This is the story of Romulus and Remus and the foundation of the great city of Rome. Before we get into the epic lineage of Rome, a brief request. If you find value in this detailed academic approach to the ancient world, the most effective way to support our work is to take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Ancient History Concepts. It is a simple gesture that makes a great difference, ensuring you won't miss our future narrations and helping our channel grow. We sincerely appreciate your support. And now, let us begin our story. Every great story has a past, a history that exists just beyond the frame of the main narrative, and the story of Rome is no exception. Before the she-wolf, before the twins, before the city itself, there was another city. A city of mythic grandeur, now reduced to a smouldering ruin on the coast of Anatolia. Our story begins in the ashes of Troy. While the Greek heroes, as we have discussed, sailed for home and their cursed returns, the gods had a different plan for a small, remnant band of Trojan survivors. Their leader was a man named Aeneas, a minor prince in the grand drama of the Trojan War, but one who possessed two qualities that made him essential to the gods. He was the son of the goddess Venus, and he was a man defined by a profound sense of duty. This concept of duty, which the Romans would later call pietas, is the absolute key to understanding Aeneas and the entire Roman worldview that would spring from his legend. It was not merely personal honor, it was a sacred, all-encompassing obligation to one's family, one's gods, and one's homeland. And in the final, horrific hours of Troy's destruction, Aeneas becomes its living embodiment. As the city burns around him, he does not seek personal glory or a heroic death. He seeks to save the future. In the iconic scene immortalized by the Roman poet Virgil, Aeneas flees the carnage carrying his elderly father Anchises on his shoulders, who in turn clutches the household gods, the Penates. By his other hand, Aeneas leads his young son, Ascanius. He is a man literally burdened by his past and his future, a living bridge between the generation that was lost and the one that was yet to be born. Guided by prophecy and the will of his divine mother, Aeneas and his fellow survivors set sail, but not to find a new home, to fulfill a destiny. Their journey across the Mediterranean is a long and harrowing ordeal, a kind of Roman Odyssey, but with a crucial difference. Where the Greek hero Odysseus fought desperately to return to a past he had lost, the Trojan hero Aeneas was compelled to sacrifice his personal desires for a future he was commanded to build. The most famous and tragic example of this was his affair with Dido, the powerful queen of the newly founded city of Carthage. For a time, Aeneas found peace and love there, attempting respite from his weary, storm-tossed journey. But the gods would not allow it. Reminded of his sacred mission, his pietas, he is forced to abandon Dido and sail away, a choice that breaks her heart but keeps his destiny intact. It is a quintessentially Roman lesson. The mission for the state, the fated duty, must always triumph over the passions of the individual. After years of wandering, Aeneas and his followers finally arrive at their promised land, the mouth of the Tiber River in Latium, the heartland of ancient Italy. Here they encounter the local king, a wise old ruler named Latinus, who recognizes the hand of prophecy at work and offers Aeneas the hand of his own daughter, Lavinia, in marriage. But fate is never so simple. Lavinia was already promised to another, Turnus, the proud and fiery king of the neighbouring Rutuli tribe. Enraged by the arrival of these Trojan newcomers and the loss of his bride, Turnus declares war. The conflict that follows is brutal, a final, bloody trial to determine whose destiny will control the future of Italy. It culminates in a climactic duel between the two champions. Aeneas, the weary exile fighting for a divinely ordained future, and Turnus, the proud patriot fighting to defend his homeland and his honour. Aeneas is victorious. Yet, in his victory, he shows the seed of a new kind of empire. He does not enslave the Latins or obliterate their culture. Instead, through his marriage to Lavinia, the Trojans and the Latins merge. They become one people, with one language and one destiny, their bloodlines and their gods intertwined. Aeneas had not just conquered a new land, he had laid the foundational stone of a new race, a people who could trace their ancestry back to the heroes of Troy and the gods of Olympus. The stage was now set for the next generation to carry that legacy forward. The legacy of Aeneas did not end with his death. The divine mandate, the great destiny to found a world-shaping people, was a burden passed from father to son. After Aeneas fought his final battle and was taken up to the gods, leadership of the newly merged Trojan and Latin peoples fell to his son, Ascanius. The city of Lavinium, founded by Aeneas, prospered under his rule, but Ascanius knew it was not the final destination. A prophecy had foretold that after 30 years, a new city must be established, its location to be revealed by a powerful omen, a pure white sow nursing 30 piglets, one for each of the 30 years of waiting. Upon finding this exact omen in the Alban hills, Ascanius knew the time had come. He gathered his people and founded a new settlement, not on the plains but along a high, commanding ridge overlooking a lake. He named it Alba Longa, the long white city. Its strategic placement and the divine sign that marked its location affirmed that this was the new heart of the Trojan Latin people, the next crucial step in their fated journey. It was from this mountain fortress that the descendants of Aeneas would rule for centuries, their bloodline stretching in a long, unbroken chain, a testament to the stability of their divine mandate. Thus began the dynasty of the Alban kings. Ascanius, who was also known by the name Iulus, a name that would later be of immense political importance to the powerful Julian clan, most famously Julius Caesar, who used it to claim direct divine ancestry, was followed by his own son, Silvius. The name Silvius became a dynastic title, passed down through the generations from king to king, each ruler adding to the long and peaceful history of their people. For 300 years, the line of Silvius reigned from Alba Longa, a period of quiet growth and consolidation. The heroic, violent age of Aeneas faded into revered memory, replaced by the steady, predictable governance of an established royal house. The descendants of gods and heroes were now simply kings, their lives a quiet stewardship of the destiny they had inherited. This long peace was finally shattered with the reign of the king Procas. Procas had 2 sons, and in them the 2 eternal archetypes of leadership were embodied. The elder son was Numitor, a man of gentle disposition, content with his birthright, and respected as the just and rightful heir to the throne. The younger son was Amulius, a man of fiery ambition who looked upon his brother's inheritance not with respect but with envy. His heart was filled with a lust for power that could not be satisfied by second place. Upon his death, King Procas bequeathed his kingdom to his sons, and in one version of the tale, he divided his legacy. To Numitor, the elder, he left the throne and the political authority of Alba Longa. To Amulius, the younger, he left the entire royal treasury, the accumulated wealth of their long dynasty. Amulius, cunning and ruthless, immediately saw that wealth was the true path to power. He used his vast inheritance to buy loyalty, to build a private army, and to corrupt the institutions of the state. The choice was made. The long, sacred line of kings, stretching from the divine Aeneas, was about to be broken not by a foreign enemy or a divine catastrophe, but by the simple, brutal greed of a brother. The age of peace was over, and an act of profound treachery was about to unfold. With the wealth of the kingdom in his hands, and the ambition of a tyrant in his heart, Amulius did not hesitate. The throne of Alba Longa, which was his brother Numitor's by birthright and tradition, now became the singular object of his desire. He used the royal treasury to hire mercenaries, to bribe officials, and to sow dissent among the nobles, portraying his gentle brother as weak and unfit to rule. The coup was swift and decisive. Amulius, at the head of a force loyal only to his gold, stormed the palace, deposed his own brother, and seized the crown. Numitor, the rightful king, was not killed, an act that might have sparked a popular revolt, but was instead cast out, exiled from his own court and forced to live in obscurity, a powerless and tragic figurehead of the legitimate regime. A usurper's crown, however, is never stable. Amulius knew that as long as Numitor's bloodline had the potential to continue, his own reign was in jeopardy. A legitimate heir could one day become a rallying point for all those who resented his rule. To secure his stolen throne, he acted with chilling foresight and brutality. First, he had Numitor's sons hunted down and murdered, extinguishing the male line of his rival. This left only one remaining threat, one final branch on the family tree that needed to be pruned. Numitor's daughter, the princess Rhea Silvia. Killing a royal princess outright was a bloody and risky proposition. Instead, Amulius devised a far more insidious and politically brilliant plan, a solution that wrapped his cruelty in the veneer of sacred piety. He would not make Rhea Silvia a victim, he would make her a priestess. He announced that she would be granted the highest honour a woman in their society could receive. She was to become a Vestal Virgin. To the public, this appeared as a magnanimous gesture, elevating his niece to a position of immense respect. In reality, it was a life sentence. The Vestals were the priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Their most sacred duty was to tend to the eternal flame in the goddess's temple, a flame that was believed to be intrinsically linked to the continuation and security of the state. To be chosen as a Vesta was a great honour, but it came at an absolute price. They were required to swear a solemn vow of chastity for 30 years. Any Vestal who broke this vow and was found to have taken a lover was guilty of a profound act of sacrilege, and the punishment was one of the most terrifying the ancient world could devise: to be buried alive in a subterranean chamber with only a crust of bread and a sip of water. By forcing this honour upon Rhea Silvia, Amulius had placed her in a gilded cage. He had weaponized religion and tradition to ensure she would have no husband and, more importantly, no sons. He had, in his mind, legally and spiritually extinguished Numitor's line forever. With his brother exiled, his nephews dead, and his niece locked away in a sacred prison of perpetual virginity, Amulius finally felt secure on his throne. The long divine lineage of Aeneas and the kings of Alba Longa had been severed. Destiny itself, it seemed, had been outmaneuvered by the ambition of one ruthless man, but fate, as the gods had long ago decreed, is not so easily defied. The story we have recounted so far of epic heroes, divine lineages, and a long, stable dynasty of kings ruling a great city is a powerful and compelling narrative. It is the story the Romans eventually told about themselves. But as we stand at this precipice in the myth, with the rightful heir cast out and a tyrant on the throne, let us pause. Let us act as historical detectives, peel back the layers of this grand legend, and ask a crucial question. What did the world of Iron Age Latium, in the centuries just before the traditional founding of Rome in 753 BC, actually look like? The answer, revealed not by poetry but by the archaeologist's spade, is something quite different, and in many ways, even more fascinating. The archaeological record does not show a landscape dominated by large, centralized kingdoms like the myth of Alba Longa suggests. Instead, the reality of the 9th and 8th centuries BC was far more humble and fragmented. The region of Latium was a patchwork of hills and marshy valleys, through which the Tiber River flowed to the sea. This was a pre-urban world, populated by a people we now call the Latial culture. They were not citizens of a great kingdom, but pastoralists and farmers, their lives dictated by the seasons and the needs of their livestock. Their society was organized not around a king and his court, but around the clan and the tribe, the fundamental units of a simpler, more local existence. Instead of a single mighty city, the famous hills that would one day become the heart of Rome, the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, were home to a collection of small, independent villages. Imagine not a sprawling metropolis, but a series of fortified hilltop settlements, each likely housing a few hundred people at most. Their inhabitants lived in simple wooden huts of wattle and daub, the outlines of which have been found as post holes bored into the rock of the Palatine hill itself. The so-called hut of Romulus, lovingly preserved and rebuilt by the later Romans, was a powerful symbol precisely because it recalled this humble, rustic beginning. So why the discrepancy? Why tell a story of powerful kings if the reality was a scattering of shepherds' villages? Because the historical founding of Rome was almost certainly not the act of a single hero on a single day. Rather, it was a long, slow, and organic process that historians call Synoecism, the gradual merging of several separate communities into a single unified political entity. Over generations, the villages on the 7 hills would have begun to cooperate for mutual defence, to trade in a common marketplace in the marshy valley below, the future Roman Forum, and to worship at a shared religious site. The myth of Romulus is a brilliant piece of narrative compression. It takes this messy, century-long process of unification and gives it a face, a date, and a single dramatic story. It creates a heroic founder and a definitive starting point for a people whose true origins were far more scattered. The grand tale of Alba Longa provides a prestigious, epic backstory for what was, in reality, a far more modest beginning. With this crucial context in mind, the myth takes on a new light. It is not a literal history, but a powerful act of identity creation. And it is to that myth we now return, to see how a divine power would intervene in the world of men, to ensure that from these humble hilltop villages, the seed of a future empire would be planted. In his court at Alba Longa, the usurper Amulius believed he had achieved a final perfect victory. The rightful bloodline of Aeneas, in his mind, was a river that had been successfully dammed. With Rhea Silvia confined to the temple of Vesta, bound by a sacred vow of chastity, the threat of a legitimate heir was neutralized. He had used the very mechanisms of piety to commit the perfect crime. But the gods of Rome were not passive observers, and the destiny they had woven was not so easily unravelled. Amulius had accounted for the laws of men, but he had failed to account for the passions of a god. One day, as Rhea Silvia went to a sacred grove to draw water for a temple ritual, a deep shadow fell over the land. The sun seemed to darken, and an awesome, terrifying presence filled the air. This was no mortal intruder. It was the god Mars, the formidable Olympian, the embodiment of military fury, valor, and untamed masculine power. The encounter that followed is shrouded in mythic ambiguity. Some accounts suggest a dream or a vision, others a direct and overwhelming visitation. What is clear is that the will of the god was absolute. Before this divine force, the vows of a mortal priestess, however sacred, were rendered meaningless. The god of war had chosen Rhea Silvia as the mother of his children, and in doing so, he personally intervened to ensure that the sacred bloodline of Alba Longa would not die out. When the divine presence receded, Rhea Silvia was left in a state of profound terror. She had been chosen by a god, but she was also a priestess who had broken the most sacred vow of her order. She soon discovered that she was pregnant. This was not a blessing, but a death sentence. To Amulius, this would not be seen as a miracle, but as a direct transgression punishable by the most horrific death imaginable. Yet, she was also carrying the sons of Mars himself, a fact that filled her with a sliver of hope that some divine protection might yet shield them from the vengeance of the mortal king she knew was coming. This divine parentage is perhaps the most important psychological element of the entire Roman foundation myth. The Romans could have chosen any god to be their progenitor. By choosing Mars, they were making a powerful statement about how they saw themselves. They were not just a people of law or commerce, they were, at their very core, a people of war. Their founder, and by extension their entire city, was infused with the DNA of the war god. This myth provided a divine explanation for Rome's relentless military prowess, its staggering success in warfare, and its unshakable belief in a manifest destiny to conquer. Their martial spirit was not a political choice. It was a biological inheritance from their divine father. When the time came, Rhea Silvia gave birth to 2 sons. They were exceptionally fine and healthy boys, and in their cries, one could almost hear the future clash of legions. But their birth was immediately discovered, and the news was brought before the furious King Amulius. His perfect plan was in ruins. The bloodline he had tried so hard to extinguish had returned, now twice as strong, and with the implicit backing of an enraged Olympian god. A new, more direct plan was required. The infants had to die. King Amulius was trapped in a tyrant's worst nightmare. His meticulous plan to secure his legacy had been undone by the one force he could not control, the will of a god. Now, faced with the twin sons of Mars, his paranoia turned to cold fury. He could not risk allowing them to live. Their very existence was a challenge to his legitimacy. He pronounced a sentence of death upon the infants, and, for their mother Rhea Silvia, he decreed the full, horrific punishment for a Vestal who had broken her vows. She was to be imprisoned, condemned to await her grim fate. For the boys, he commanded his servants to carry out a simpler, yet equally final solution. They were to be drowned in the Tiber River. This method of execution, exposure to the elements, is a recurring theme in the myths of great heroes, from Moses in his basket of reeds to Oedipus left on a mountainside. It is a way for a story to test a hero's destiny. By casting the infants out, Amulius was unknowingly placing them into the hands of a power far greater than his own, fate itself. The king's servants, carrying the 2 infants in a crude wooden basket, proceeded to the banks of the Tiber to carry out their grim task. But here, divine providence intervened in the form of a natural disaster. The river, swollen with heavy rains, had overflowed its banks, turning the surrounding fields into a series of shallow, impassable pools. The servants could not reach the main channel where the current was strong enough to ensure the infants would be swept away and drowned. Faced with this obstacle, and perhaps with a flicker of pity for their helpless charges, the servants made a fateful decision. Believing they had fulfilled the spirit, if not the letter of their orders, they left the basket in the stagnant floodwaters at the very edge of the plain, assuming that as the river receded, it would carry the cradle and its occupants into the main current to their doom. They returned to Amulius and reported that the sons of Rhea Silvia were gone, and the king, satisfied, believed his problem was finally solved. But the river had other plans. The Roman landscape itself seemed to conspire to save its future founders. As the floodwaters began to recede, the basket did not drift out into the deadly current. Instead, the gentle pull of the receding water nudged the cradle along until it snagged on the roots of a wild fig tree, coming to rest on solid ground. And the place where it landed was no random patch of mud. It was at the very base of the Palatine Hill, the exact geographic location that would one day become the political and symbolic heart of the Roman world. Fate had not just saved the boys from the water, it had delivered them, like a piece of sacred cargo, to the precise location of their future destiny. Safe from the river, they now faced a new set of threats: the wilderness, with its predators and its unforgiving elements. As the two infants lay helpless in their cradle, their hungry cries began to echo through the empty grove, a desperate sound that would soon be answered by the most unlikely of saviours. Lying at the foot of the Palatine Hill, the twin sons of Mars were saved from the river only to face the vast and indifferent wilderness. Their cries, the universal sound of helpless infancy, pierced the silence of the grove. It was a sound that should have attracted predators, a signal of an easy meal, and true to the laws of nature, a predator did arrive. A she-wolf, driven from the hills by thirst, came down to the water's edge. She was a hunter, an embodiment of the wild's unforgiving nature. But as she approached the crying infants, something miraculous occurred. The will of the gods, the divine imperative of their father Mars, washed over her. Her predatory instinct was transformed into a powerful and unnatural maternal urge. This is the central, defining image of the entire Roman foundation myth, an image that would be immortalized in bronze and stone for 1,000 years. The great she-wolf, the Lupa, did not harm the boys. Instead, with a tenderness that defied her very nature, she began to lick them clean, and then lay down beside them, offering her own teats to the hungry infants. The sons of the god of war found their first nourishment not from a human mother, but from a wild beast, drawing their sustenance and perhaps their spirit from this fierce, lupine guardian. She led them to her den, a cave on the Palatine that would forever be known as the Lupercal, and for a time this feral nursery became their home. Their divine protection was not limited to the wolf alone. Soon, a second of their father's sacred creatures took notice of the strange sight. A woodpecker, the picus, a bird considered a herald of the god Mars, began to fly to the den, bringing the boys scraps of food it had gathered, berries, insects, and bits of honeycomb. This dual guardianship left no room for doubt. The survival of the twins was no mere accident of nature, it was a coordinated supernatural event, a clear sign that the god of war was actively protecting his offspring through the agents of the wild. The symbolism here is immensely powerful and tells us a great deal about the Roman self-image. The she-wolf represents the dual nature of Rome itself. On the one hand, she is a fierce and relentless predator, a deadly threat to all her enemies. On the other, she is a fiercely protective and nurturing mother to her own. The Roman state would come to see itself in exactly these terms: a brutal conqueror to the outside world, but a source of law, order, and sustenance for its own citizens. The wolf became the soul of the city. The woodpecker, meanwhile, a persistent and resourceful creature, added another layer of divine favour, a sign of the determination and fortitude that would characterise the Roman spirit. This feral upbringing, nourished by a wolf and a woodpecker, forged the boys' character. They were children of the wilderness, their natures shaped by forces untamed by civilization. But this supernatural protection could not last forever. They were still mortal, and to fulfill their destiny, they would need more than just the milk of a wolf and the scraps of a bird. They would need the care and language of a human family to bridge the gap between their wild origins and their world-shaking future. And so, as fate would have it, a human was about to stumble upon the god's secret nursery. The supernatural protection of the gods could shelter the infants from the wild, but it could not raise them in the world of men. For that, a human hand was needed, and fate, having already guided the boys to their destined location, now guided the right man to them. His name was Faustulus, and he was not just any shepherd. He was the chief shepherd in service to King Amulius himself. In a stroke of profound irony, the man tasked with overseeing the usurper's flocks would become the foster father to the very children the king had condemned. One evening, as Faustulus was patrolling the pastures at the base of the Palatine, he followed the tracks of the she-wolf, curious about her recent behaviour. The tracks led him to the Lupercal cave, where he witnessed a sight that stopped him in his tracks. The predator, gently tending to 2 healthy human infants. Faustulus was a simple man, but he was also pious. He understood immediately that he was in the presence of a divine miracle, a sign from the gods that these were no ordinary foundlings. He waited until the she-wolf left the den to hunt, and then, with a heart full of awe and trepidation, he carefully gathered the infants and brought them back to his humble hut on the hill. There he presented them to his wife, Laurentia. As fate would have it, she was herself in deep mourning, having recently lost her own newborn child. Seeing these 2 boys delivered to her doorstep by what could only be divine providence, she embraced them as a gift from the gods, a remedy for her own sorrow. She took them as her own, raising them alongside her other children, giving them the love and care of a human mother. It is here that we must pause and address a fascinating historical debate, one that shows the Romans themselves grappling with the more unbelievable aspects of their own legend. Some later, more skeptical Roman historians, attempting to rationalize the story, proposed an alternative theory. They noted that the Latin word for she-wolf, Lupa, was also a common and coarse slang term for a prostitute. These writers suggested that perhaps Laurentia was not a simple shepherd's wife, but a woman of ill repute, and that it was her scandalous nickname, the she-wolf, that gave rise to the more palatable myth of the animal guardian. Whether you choose to believe the mythic version, a tale of divine intervention, or the rationalist one, a story of a marginalised woman taking in abandoned children, the outcome remains the same. Romulus and Remus survived. They found a home and a family. In the house of Faustulus, the twins grew from infancy into boyhood. They were raised not as princes, but as shepherds, their days spent learning the rhythms of the land, defending the flocks from predators, and enduring the hardships of a rustic life. This humble upbringing, far from the decadent and corrupt court of their uncle Amulius, forged their characters. It instilled in them a physical toughness, a keen self-reliance, and a deep understanding of the common man. But even as they lived the lives of shepherds, their divine blood and noble ancestry could not be entirely concealed. It shone through in their bearing, their strength, and in a natural charisma that would soon set them apart from all their peers. As the years passed in the shepherd's hut, Romulus and Remus grew from boys into young men, and it became clear to all that they were not cut from the same cloth as their peers. Their divine and royal blood manifested itself in everything they did. They were taller, stronger, and faster than any other shepherd on the hills. But their superiority was more than just physical. They possessed an innate confidence, a natural authority that drew others to them. While their adoptive father Faustulus had taught them the virtues of a simple life, the spirit of their true father, Mars, and the regal bearing of their grandfather, Numitor, could not be suppressed. They were princes living the lives of paupers, and their true nature was beginning to shine through. Their first taste of leadership was born from necessity. The life of a shepherd was a constant struggle against the dangers of the wilderness, and the twins quickly took it upon themselves to be the primary defenders of their community's flocks. They became peerless hunters, tracking and killing the wolves and other predators that threatened their livelihood with a courage that bordered on recklessness. Their success in this defensive role soon emboldened them. They were not content to merely react to threats. Their martial spirit demanded that they seek them out. Their attention soon turned from the four-legged predators to the two-legged ones, the bands of robbers and bandits who plagued the countryside, preying on the hard work of honest shepherds. Romulus and Remus began to organise the other young men of the pastures into a formidable fighting force. This was their first legion, a loyal band of youths, or juvenes, drawn to the twins' charisma and courage. Under their command, this band of shepherds transformed from a scattered group of individuals into a disciplined and effective unit. They began to actively hunt the bandits, turning the tables on them, ambushing them in the forests and reclaiming stolen livestock and goods. Their reputation grew with every victory. They were not merely fighters. They were leaders who understood the importance of loyalty. After every successful raid, they would divide the spoils of their victory equally amongst their followers, keeping little for themselves. This act of redistribution, a stark contrast to the greed of the king who sat on the throne in Alba Longa, cemented their status as heroes of the common man. They were seen as champions of the weak and providers for their community. Their fame spread across the hills of Latium. They were the undisputed leaders of the Palatine settlement, their authority derived not from a crown, but earned through courage, action, and a clear sense of justice. This growing power, however, could not exist in a vacuum. Their actions, while celebrated by their followers, were a disruption to the established order and would inevitably draw the attention of their neighbours, setting the stage for a conflict that would change their lives and the course of history forever. The growing power of Romulus and Remus and their band of followers did not go unnoticed. While they saw themselves as champions of justice, their neighbours saw them as little more than disruptive raiders. A bitter feud soon erupted between the shepherds of the Palatine Hill, led by the twins, and the shepherds loyal to the deposed king Numitor, who grazed their flocks on the nearby Aventine Hill. The conflict festered, with accusations of stolen livestock and territorial disputes escalating into violent skirmishes. The twins, in their youthful confidence, had become a destabilizing force, and a confrontation with the old regime was now inevitable. The tipping point occurred during the Lupercalia, a wild and ancient pastoral festival of purification and fertility. While Romulus was occupied preparing a sacrifice for the gods, Remus, ever the more impetuous of the two, led a cattle raid deep into Numitor's lands. But this time, Numitor's men were prepared. Having been warned of the raid, they lay in wait, setting a carefully planned ambush. In the chaotic struggle that followed, Remus and his followers were overwhelmed. Though he fought with the strength of his divine father, Remus was captured. Romulus, hearing of the fight, rushed to help, but was too late. For the first time in their lives, the two inseparable brothers were divided, and one of them was now a prisoner. In a twist of fate that could only have been orchestrated by the gods, the captured Remus was not taken to the ruling king Amulius for punishment. The crime had been committed on Numitor's land, against Numitor's property. And so, bound and defiant, Remus was dragged before the old, deposed king to answer for his crimes. The shepherds presented their case, demanding that the old man dispense justice upon the leader of the gang that had terrorized them, and so the two ends of the broken royal line were finally brought together. The grandfather and the grandson stood face to face, though neither knew the truth of their connection. But as Numitor looked upon the young prisoner, he saw not a common criminal. He was struck by Remus's proud bearing, his defiant spirit, and a regal quality that seemed entirely out of place for a simple shepherd. A flicker of memory and an impossible thought began to stir in the old man's mind. He noted the young man's age and calculated that it matched perfectly with the years that had passed since his own infant grandsons were condemned to the river. He began to question Remus, not as a judge interrogating a thief, but as a man searching for a ghost. The fateful confrontation had set the stage. The secrets of the past were now on the verge of being revealed, threatening to bring down the entire corrupt kingdom that Amulius had built. The gears of fate, having brought the grandfather and grandson face to face, now began to turn with breathtaking speed. In the house of the deposed King Numitor, the interrogation of the captive Remus took an unexpected turn. As Numitor gently questioned the defiant young man about his origins, Remus recounted the only story he knew. The tale of two twin brothers, abandoned to the river, suckled by a she-wolf, and raised in a shepherd's hut. With every word Remus spoke, the impossible suspicion in Numitor's mind hardened into a certainty that stole his breath. The age of the boys, the location of their discovery, their noble and fearless bearing, it was all a perfect match. The old king, who had lived for nearly 2 decades lost in the grief of his murdered grandsons, was now staring at one of them, alive and breathing before him. The interview was no longer an interrogation, it was a miraculous reunion. At the very same time, back on the Palatine Hill, a different revelation was taking place. Romulus, frantic over his brother's capture, was preparing to launch a reckless frontal assault to rescue him. It was then that the shepherd Faustulus knew the time for secrets was over. Fearing that the boys were walking into a trap and that their true identity was their only shield, he finally revealed the truth he had guarded for so long. He took Romulus aside and told him everything. He described the day he found them by the river, the she-wolf, and the royal tokens and cradle he had secretly preserved since that day as proof. He confessed that he had always suspected their divine and royal origins. Romulus, who had grown up believing himself to be the son of a simple shepherd, was now confronted with a staggering new reality. He was not just a leader of men. He was the son of the god Mars, the grandson of the rightful king of Alba Longa and the heir to a stolen throne. His personal quest to save his brother was instantly transformed into something far grander, a sacred duty to avenge his family and reclaim his birthright. The anger he felt over his brother's capture now had a clear target, the tyrant Amulius. And so, in two separate locations, the truth was revealed, and the two brothers, though physically apart, were now united in a single, explosive purpose. Remus, now aware that his captor was his grandfather, began to plot with Numitor from within the city. Romulus, now aware of his destiny, began to rally his band of shepherds, no longer for a rescue mission, but for a revolution. The private drama of a single family had ended. A public war for the soul of a kingdom was about to begin. Armed with the truth of their identity, the twin sons of Mars moved with the speed and fury of their divine father. A lifetime of rustic hardship had made them decisive, and their shared purpose now made them unstoppable. They devised a brilliant and coordinated two-pronged assault on Alba Longa, a strategy designed to trap the tyrant Amulius between two closing fists. Romulus, on the outside, was tasked with creating a diversion. He didn't march his small army of shepherds directly to the main gates. Instead, he prepared for a swift strike against a weaker point in the city's defences, aiming to draw the king's professional soldiers out of the city centre and into a chaotic skirmish. His role was to be the external threat, the loud and visible danger that would preoccupy the usurper's forces. Meanwhile, Remus, already inside the city and under the protection of his grandfather Numitor, had a different, more surgical task. He revealed his true identity to the other nobles of the court who had long resented Amulius's rule but lacked a legitimate figure to rally behind. With Remus now among them, a living, breathing heir to the throne, their quiet descent ignited into open rebellion. As Romulus launched his attack from the outside, Remus and his internal faction rose up, seizing the city's citadel and calling upon the citizens to overthrow the tyrant. The city of Alba Longa was plunged into chaos, attacked simultaneously from without and from within. The usurper Amulius was caught completely by surprise. His authority, which he had built on fear and bribery, crumbled in an instant. His soldiers, drawn out of the city to deal with Romulus's attack, were now cut off, while his power base within the palace was collapsing around him. The accounts of his final moments vary, but they all end the same way. Cornered in his own palace, abandoned by his guards, the tyrant came face to face with the very justice he had tried to drown in a river 2 decades earlier. He was cut down, his life ended by the swords of the grandsons he had wronged, his reign of treachery brought to a swift and bloody conclusion. With the fighting over and the tyrant slain, the victorious twins entered the city's forum. The people of Alba Longa, now freed from the usurper, cheered their liberators. It was a moment where the twins could have easily claimed the throne for themselves, but here they demonstrated the pietas that was their ancestral birthright. They were not, like their great-uncle Amulius, driven by personal ambition. They were agents of restoration. They sought out their grandfather, the aged and weary Numitor, and before the assembled populace, they hailed him as the true and rightful king. In an act of profound loyalty, they placed the crown back on their grandfather's head, restoring the legitimate line that Amulius had so violently severed. Justice had been done. the heroes were triumphant. But their very success had created a new and unforeseen problem: what to do with two divinely descended, supremely capable princes now that their quest was complete. With their grandfather restored to his throne, Romulus and Remus were celebrated as heroes throughout the kingdom. But the spirit that had driven them to lead shepherds and overthrow a king could not be content with the quiet life of subordinate princes. They were possessed by a shared ambition, a desire not to inherit a city, but to create one. They announced their intention to found a new settlement on the very hills where they had been saved and raised. This noble project, however, would become the source of the first and most tragic crack in their lifelong bond. The question was not if they should build, but where. Romulus, perhaps more sentimental, championed the Palatine Hill, the site of the Lupercal cave and their miraculous survival. Remus, on the other hand, argued for the strategic advantages of the nearby Aventine Hill. The dispute was fierce, a clash of two equally stubborn wills, each brother convinced that his choice was the superior one. Unable to resolve the argument, and in keeping with the traditions of their people, they agreed to let the gods decide. They would put their claim to the ultimate test, a sacred augury. This was a formal ritual of divination, a way of interpreting the will of the heavens by observing the flight of birds. For a matter of such monumental importance, they would look for a sign from a particularly powerful messenger, the vulture. Each brother would take up a ritual station on his chosen hill, watch the skies, and wait for the gods to show their favour. The one who received the superior omen would be the undisputed founder and king of the new city. It was a pious solution, but it was also a contest, a divine competition that transformed their brotherly collaboration into a direct rivalry. And so, the vigil began. Romulus ascended the Palatine Hill, and Remus the Aventine. They sat in silence, their followers gathered below, the tension mounting with every passing hour as the empty skies offered no answer. Then, a shout erupted from the Aventine. Remus had seen the first sign. A flight of 6 vultures had appeared in the sky above him. His followers roared in celebration, claiming victory. The gods had spoken first to Remus. The precedent was his. But just as the news of Remus's sign reached the Palatine, a new shout went up, this time from Romulus's followers. For in the sky above the Palatine, a second flight had appeared. Romulus had seen vultures as well, and he had seen not 6, but 12. The augury, which was meant to provide divine clarity, had instead delivered a perfect and unsolvable riddle. The dispute was now more furious than ever. Who was the true victor? Was it Remus, who had received the first sign, a clear signal of precedence? Or was it Romulus, whose sign was numerically superior, a doubling of his brother's, a clear signal of greater magnitude? There was no established rule to arbitrate such a result. Their followers, who had once been a united band, now fractured into 2 hostile factions, each championing their leader's claim. The attempt to solve their disagreement peacefully had failed spectacularly. It had only deepened the rift between them, transforming their personal dispute into a public feud and setting them on a path from which there was no return. The ambiguous prophecy of the vultures had failed to unite the brothers, it had only succeeded in driving them apart. Their followers, once a single brotherhood of shepherds, now fractured into 2 hostile camps, one on the Aventine supporting Remus's claim of precedence, the other on the Palatine championing Romulus's claim of superior numbers. The verbal arguments soon escalated, and according to some sources, the first blood was shed in violent brawls between the rival factions. The dream of a shared kingdom was dead. Ignoring the ongoing dispute, and supremely confident in the authority of his 12 vultures, Romulus decided to proceed alone. He would not wait for his brother's concession. He would found his city on the Palatine, and he would do it now. The founding of a city in the ancient world was not a matter of construction, but of sacred ritual. Romulus began by performing the solemn rites to consecrate the land. He yoked a pure white cow and a snow-white bull to a bronze plowshare, and began to carve a deep furrow in the earth, marking the boundary of his new city. This furrow was the Pomerium, a line that was not merely physical, but profoundly religious. The earth thrown inwards from the plough became the city's rampart, and the furrow itself was a sacred, magical barrier, a line that separated the ordered, civilized space of the city, Urbs, from the wild, chaotic world outside. It was a line that was to be inviolable. It was at this moment of high ritual that Remus, his heart burning with bitterness and envy, approached the scene. Seeing his brother acting as the sole founder, he began to openly mock the proceedings. To show his utter contempt for his brother's nascent city, he committed the ultimate act of sacrilege. With a derisive laugh, he easily leaped over the half-ploughed furrow and the low earthen wall. This was not childish teasing, it was a deeply symbolic act of defiance. He was demonstrating that his brother's sacred walls were meaningless, that they could be breached with contemptuous ease. He had violated the sanctity of the pomerium at the very moment of its creation. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. In a fit of uncontrollable rage at this sacrilegious act, Romulus turned on his brother. Some versions of the story say it was Romulus himself who struck the fatal blow. Others claim it was one of his loyal lieutenants named Keeler who acted to defend his leader's honor. But the outcome was the same. Remus, the boy who had survived a river and a she-wolf, was struck down and killed by his own twin brother. As Remus lay dead on the ground, Romulus stood over his body and uttered the chilling words that would echo throughout Roman history. Sic dinde, quicumque alius transiliet muenia mea. So perish any other who shall leap over my walls. In that single, terrible moment, a brutal precedent was set. The safety of Rome, the sanctity of its walls, was an absolute principle, more sacred even than the life of a brother. Romulus had founded his city, but its foundation stones were now stained with fraternal blood. He was now the first king of Rome, but he was also its first kinslayer, a dark and tragic beginning for a city that would one day rule the world. Romulus now stood as the sole, undisputed master of his new city. He gave it a name after himself, Rome, and he had a sacred boundary. But a city is more than furrows in the earth. A king is nothing without a people to rule. His first challenge as sovereign was to populate the empty space he had created. For this, he turned not to conquest, but to a stroke of pragmatic genius that would define the Roman character for all time. Between the Capitoline and the Arx hills, he declared a space to be a sacred asylum, a sanctuary open to all. He sent word to the surrounding lands that anyone, fugitive, runaway slave, man exiled for debt or crime, or simply an ambitious soul seeking a fresh start, could find refuge and a new life in his city, with their past wiped clean. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A flood of men from all over Latium and beyond flocked to Rome. They were a motley collection of the dispossessed, the desperate, and the daring. These were not the noble families of established cities. They were a rugged, tough, and ambitious rabble, united by a fierce loyalty to the city and the king who had given them a second chance. Romulus had his population, but in solving one problem, he had created another, equally dire one. His new city was a brotherhood, a war camp, but it was not a society. It was a city almost entirely of men. Without women, there could be no families, no children, and no future. Rome was doomed to die out with its first generation. Seeking a peaceful solution, Romulus sent envoys to the neighbouring cities, most notably to the powerful Sabine tribe. He humbly requested the right of intermarriage, arguing that all cities start from humble beginnings and that the gods had clearly favoured his own. But the established communities looked upon Rome with suspicion and contempt. They saw a city of vagabonds and criminals, and they scornfully rejected the proposal, some even mockingly asking why Romulus didn't open an asylum for women as well. The humiliation was a grave insult to the proud new city. Diplomacy had failed. Faced with this scornful rejection, Romulus's pragmatism took a much darker and more decisive turn. He devised a cunning plan. He announced that he would be holding a grand festival in Rome in honour of the god Consus, a deity of the harvest and stored grains. It was to be called the Consualia. He sent invitations far and wide, and his neighbours, their curiosity piqued by the new city and suspecting no foul play at a religious festival, came in droves. Entire families of Sabines and others flocked to Rome, eager to see the new settlement and enjoy the spectacle of chariot races and games. They were welcomed with open arms and shown to their seats. The festival began, and as the spectators became engrossed in the events, Romulus gave a prearranged signal. In that instant, the Roman men drew hidden swords, not to kill, but to create chaos. As the panicked fathers and husbands fled for their lives, each Roman grabbed the nearest young unmarried Sabine woman and carried her away. It was not a random riot. It was a brutally efficient, organised mass abduction. In a single violent afternoon, Romulus had solved his city's demographic crisis. He had secured the future of Rome by stealing its first generation of mothers. But this act of shocking brutality would not go unanswered. The enraged Sabine fathers were now massing their armies, and a terrible war was about to fall upon the fledgling city. The seizure of their daughters was an unforgivable outrage, and the Sabine people, led by their king Titus Tatius, immediately armed for war. An army was raised with a single furious purpose: to march on Rome, punish the upstart king, and reclaim their stolen women. The ensuing war was fierce. The Sabines managed to capture the Capitoline Hill, one of Rome's key strongholds, through the treachery of a Roman woman named Tarpeia. She promised to open a gate for the Sabine army in exchange for what they wore on their left arms, expecting their heavy gold bracelets. The Sabines, despising the traitor even as they used her, kept their word. As they entered the gate, each soldier threw not his bracelet, but his heavy shield, also carried on the left arm, upon her, crushing her to death for her greed. Her name would live on as a byword for treason. The war culminated in a final pitched battle in the valley between the Capitoline and Palatine hills, the very space that would one day become the bustling Roman Forum. The fighting was desperate and bloody. The Romans, led by Romulus, fought with the ferocity of men defending their new homes and the families they had just acquired. The Sabines, under Titus Tatius, fought with the righteous fury of fathers and brothers seeking to avenge their honour. Neither side could gain an advantage. The battle devolved into a brutal stalemate, threatening to annihilate both armies. It was at this moment of maximum bloodshed that the battle was interrupted by a third army, one that no one had anticipated. The Sabine women themselves, who had now been Roman wives for some time and had even borne children to their new husbands, made a choice. They could no longer stand by as their fathers and their husbands slaughtered one another. In a coordinated, courageous act, they ran from their homes and onto the battlefield. With their hair unbound in a sign of mourning and holding their newborn infants aloft for all to see, they placed themselves directly between the two clashing battle lines. Their appeal, as recorded by the historian Livy, was one of the most powerful in Roman legend. They turned to their Sabine kin and cried that it was their fault, and that the armies should turn their anger on them, for they would rather die than live as widows or as orphans on the same day. Then they turned to their Roman husbands, pleading with them to stop the slaughter of their new fathers-in-law. This incredible act of bravery, and the sight of their own daughters and grandchildren standing in the heart of the killing field, stunned both armies into silence. Their swords lowered. The rage in their hearts was quenched by a wave of sorrow and shame. The battle ended not with a victory, but with a miraculous reconciliation. The soldiers, moved by the plea of the women, laid down their arms. A peace treaty was drawn up, but it went far beyond a simple truce. The Sabines and the Romans agreed to become one people. The two nations would merge, and the two kings, Romulus and Titus Tatius, would rule jointly from Rome. The Sabine families relocated to the city, bringing with them their wealth, their customs, and their gods. The war, which had begun with a brutal act of division, had ended in a definitive act of unification. Rome had not just survived its first great war, it had absorbed its enemy and doubled its strength, establishing a pattern of assimilation that would define its imperial success for centuries to come. The union of the Latins and the Sabines created a powerful new state, jointly ruled by Romulus and Titus Tatius. For 5 years they reigned together, a symbol of the city's new dual identity. After Tatius was killed in a skirmish while visiting another town, rule of the now strengthened city reverted to Romulus alone. For the many years that followed, he proved to be as skilled a king as he was a warrior. His reign was not just one of conquest, but of creation. He was credited by later Romans with establishing the city's most enduring institutions, transforming his rough settlement of warriors into a functioning society. He selected 100 of the most noble men to serve as a council of elders, a body he called the Senate, from the Latin senex, meaning old man. These fathers, or patres, would form the backbone of Roman governance for centuries. He organized the people into 3 tribes and 30 curiae, or voting blocks, creating the first Roman popular assembly. Most importantly, he organized the military into the disciplined units that would become the prototype for the legendary Roman legions. Romulus was not just the founder of Rome's walls, he was the architect of its social and political DNA. After a long and successful reign of nearly 4 decades, the story of Romulus comes to a dramatic and mysterious end. The king, now a respected and powerful figure, was conducting a grand review of his army on the Campus Martius, the field of his father, Mars. Suddenly, the sky turned dark. A terrifying storm erupted with violent winds, thunder and lightning, engulfing the entire assembly. A thick cloud descended from the heavens and enveloped the king's throne. The other men, in a panic, scattered for cover. When the storm passed moments later and the light returned, the throne was empty. Romulus, the first king of Rome, had vanished from the face of the earth. What truly happened in that storm became a subject of intense debate, even among the ancient Romans themselves. 2 competing stories emerged. The first, and the one favoured by the state, was one of apotheosis. It was believed that his father Mars had descended in his war chariot and carried his heroic son up to the heavens to take his place among the gods. This was a fitting, glorious end for the divine founder. But a darker, more cynical rumour also persisted. Some whispered that the senators, who had grown tired of Romulus's increasingly autocratic rule, had used the chaos of the storm as a cover to murder their king. In this version, they dismembered his body on the spot, each senator hiding a piece under his robe to dispose of the evidence later. This version reflects a deep-seated Roman suspicion of absolute power and the eternal political struggle between the king and the aristocracy. The disappearance of the king threw the city into a state of confusion and fear. It was at this critical moment that a respected nobleman named Proculus Julius rode into the forum with incredible news. He declared under oath that Romulus had appeared to him in a glorified divine form as he rode into the city. According to Proculus, the deified Romulus had given him a final message for his people. "Go," the vision commanded, "and tell the Romans that it is the will of heaven that my Rome shall be the capital of the world. Let them learn to be soldiers. Let them know and teach their children that no power on earth can stand against Roman arms." He then announced that he was to be worshipped under a new name as the god Quirinus. This timely vision calmed the terrified populace, suppressed the ugly rumours of murder, and gave a divine sanction to Rome's future imperial mission. The city's founder was now its protector god. The journey from the abandoned infant in the basket to the deity on Olympus was complete. To conclude our journey, we must return to our central question. What is the ultimate meaning of this wild and violent story? The legend of Romulus and Remus is not merely a curious folktale. It is arguably the most successful piece of national branding in history. It is a profound character study, a story the Romans told themselves for 1,000 years to explain their own complex and often contradictory nature. When we dissect its key events, we find that each one serves to justify a core component of the Roman worldview. It begins with their very blood. The choice of Mars as the divine father is no accident. This immediately establishes the Romans as a people of war, a civilization whose primary virtue or virtues is martial prowess. Their destiny to conquer was not a political ambition acquired over time. It was a biological inheritance, a divine mandate written into their very DNA. This divine parentage is then nurtured by a divine beast. The image of the she-wolf is a masterpiece of national symbolism. It defines Rome as a dual-natured power. To her own, she is a fierce and protective mother, providing sustenance and safety. To her enemies, she is a relentless predator. This single, powerful image perfectly encapsulates the two faces of the Roman state, the nurturing lawgiver at home and the ravenous conqueror abroad. But it is the act of fratricide that provides the most chilling and most essential insight into the Roman mind. The murder of Remus by his brother is the story's dark heart, and it establishes the single most important principle of Roman civilization. The city itself, the state, the res publica, is the highest possible good. Its safety and sanctity are absolute, and any threat, no matter its origin, must be eliminated. The myth teaches a brutal lesson. For Rome to be born strong and undivided, Remus had to die. The bonds of family, even the sacred connection between twins, are secondary to the integrity of the state. This was a ruthless political calculus that would be understood and enacted by Roman leaders for the next millennium. This brutal pragmatism is reinforced by the events that followed. The establishment of the Asylum shows a practical disregard for the past in favour of future strength. Unlike the Greek city-states, who often prided themselves on ethnic purity, Rome's founder built his city with outsiders, fugitives, and the dispossessed. It was a statement that being a Roman was not about where you came from, but about your loyalty to the city. Likewise, the seizure of the Sabine women, a horrifying act of violence, is portrayed as a necessary evil, a decisive solution to a demographic crisis that threatened the city's existence. Taken together, these stories forged the character of a civilization, born of a war god, suckled by a wolf, founded on a brother's murder, and populated by outcasts. It is the portrait of a people who saw themselves as destined, pragmatic, inclusive by necessity, and utterly ruthless when their survival was at stake. The story of Romulus was far more than a simple origin myth. It was a living political and moral charter for the Roman people, its legacy casting a long shadow over the 1,000 years of their history. The symbols of the founding were everywhere, serving as constant, powerful reminders of the city's character. The bronze statue of the she-wolf suckling the twins, the Lupa Capitolina, became one of the most potent icons of the state, a totem of Rome's savage strength and maternal protection. Roman leaders, from the generals of the Republic to the emperors who followed, understood the power of this story. They used it as a touchstone to justify their actions and to define their own identities. When Augustus, the first emperor, sought to restore a state shattered by civil war, he didn't present himself as a radical revolutionary. Instead, he framed himself as a second Romulus, a new founder restoring the city to its core principles, all while subtly tracing his own family's lineage back to Romulus's divine ancestor, Aeneas. The myth was a wellspring of political legitimacy. But the legacy of the founder was not just one of glory and divine destiny. It also carried a dark and troubling precedent. The murder of Remus at the city's founding established a brutal political calculus that would haunt Rome forever. That for the good of the state, any law, any tradition, any bond, even the most sacred tie of kinship could be broken. The shadow of this first act of civil violence never truly left the city. Centuries later, when the Roman Republic began to tear itself apart in a series of bloody civil wars, the story of Romulus and Remus took on a new and terrifying relevance. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his legion, plunging the Republic into a war against his rival Pompey, it was brother turning against brother on a national scale. When Octavian, the future Augustus, waged a final climactic war against his former ally Mark Antony, it was once again a struggle between two Romans for the soul of the state. The fratricide on the Palatine Hills seemed to be reenacted on a global stage, again and again. In each case, the victor justified his actions not as personal ambition, but as a grim necessity for the restoration and preservation of Rome, echoing Romulus's cold declaration that any who threatened the walls must perish. And so, the legacy of Rome's founding is one of profound duality. It is a story of divine favour and heroic destiny, of a city willed into existence by the gods. But it is also a story that begins with a brother's murder, an act that sanctified the idea that the survival of Rome justifies any means. This brutal, pragmatic, and often tragic worldview, born in that first argument between two twins on a lonely hilltop, would be the engine that drove the Roman legions to conquer the known world, and the poison that would ultimately lead the Republic to consume itself. The city, born from a wolf's shadow, never truly escaped its wild and bloody origins.